Good afternoon. My name is Michael Kaiser. I'm Professor of Fisheries Conservation at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh, UK. The first thing I'd like you to note today is that 25% of the world's landings of fish are caught using towed bottom fishing gear, so it's an important form of food production for the world population. The other thing to note is that compared to other forms of terrestrial food production, bottom trawl fisheries often outperform those terrestrial forms of food production per unit of protein landed. So if we look at whitefish, small pelagics and large pelagics, you can see that their overall carbon dioxide outputs are far lower than for pork, chicken and beef production. Terrestrial food production, of course, has well-known impacts on the environment. Agricultural systems tend to reduce the biodiversity of the landscape, often removing trees initially and then continually modifying the landscape in which to cultivate food. And of course there's the usual addition of other products such as fertilizers, possibly also pesticides, and for example in the case of sort of poultry production and aquaculture, the use of antimicrobials and antibiotics as well. And of course with terrestrial farming it's easy to see the impacts, and we're familiar with these on a day-to-day basis. In contrast though, bottom trawling often goes unseen, unless of course you have access to vessel monitoring system data, images from satellites. But what's even more difficult to see is the direct impact of these towed bottom fishing gears on the seabed. And I've just shown you in this picture two typical bottom fishing gears, a beam trawl in the bottom panel and an otter trawl, which is the most commonly used towed bottom fishing equipment used around the world. And here on the left we have a side-scan sonar image of the seabed showing the tracks left by the otter doors on the otter trawl across this muddy seabed environment. And this particular seabed is fished intensively and fished approximately 17 times a year in its entirety. But this is one of the most heavily and most intensively fished areas of the seabed that I've personally encountered. Now those fishing impacts of course will have a direct effect on the seabed habitat itself, simplifying and modifying it, but also creating mortality of the benthic organisms that live there. And those benthic organisms of course are important in bioturbation, in the burial of carbon within sediment stores. And with 30 years of research undertaken on the impacts of bottom trawl fisheries using both experimental and comparative studies, we now know sufficient to be able to estimate what the depletion of benthic animals is on the seabed caused by different types of fishing activity. So in this diagram, caused by otter trawling, beam trawling, or towed dredges, or hydraulic dredges at the top here. And we can predict the depletion of these animals if we know the penetration depth of these fishing gears. In other words, if you can measure the overall average penetration depth of a fishing gear, you can estimate the amount of these organisms that are removed by the fishing activity. If we know that, and we know something about the life history of these animals, looking at those short-lived, fast-growing species compared to slow-growing, long-lived species, we're able to say something about the recoverability of those different types of fauna to that impact of trawling. So here, if we're able to estimate the fraction of depletion of the animals, we can predict how many years it will take for those organisms in that community to recover from that trawl impact. Combining that information together in this very simple equation here allows us to compute a metric called the relative benthic status. So if you like, that's a relative health indicator of the benthic community on the seabed that is exposed to trawling. And the scale goes from 1, not impacted by trawling, and tends towards 0 with complete depletion. And here shown on the scale from 0 in the purple, so complete depletion, to yellow, hardly any impact of trawling at the top. If we're able to have access to maps of fishing activity, as we do here for scallop dredging off the coast of Scotland in the UK, we can plot out where that fishing activity occurs. And if we're able to understand the frequency of the fishing and the intensity of the fishing measured in swept area ratio, we can then calculate the relative benthic status of the seabed, which you see here in this panel. The important thing to note, though, is that first of all the fishing is patchy, it's not uniformly distributed across the seabed, and that for a large proportion of the area that is in fact scallop dredged, the relative benthic status of the animal community is relatively high because of the relative light intensity of the fishing in those areas. If we strip out these light intensity fishing areas, we can then focus on those areas which are most heavily impacted as a result of scallop fishing. And these are the areas maybe where more management is actually required, and perhaps where the effect on carbon stores might be greatest. Now, our understanding of the impacts of fishing on carbon buried within sediment is unknown. There are many biogeochemical processes that we do not necessarily understand. For example, what is the vertical distribution of labile carbon from the surface of the sediment down to deep within the sediment, where the carbon is likely to be much older and hence less labile. We also have to remember that fishing occurs in a variety of different types of sedimentary habitats, from sand ranging through to mud, and hence the amount of carbon stored in these different environments will vary. Similarly, the intensity of fishing is going to vary across these habitats, and the type of fishing activity will vary as well. So we need to understand issues such as the reactivity of the carbon, and we need to think about the potential for the fishing activity to resuspend those sediments and understand what actually happens to the carbon within those sediments once it's resuspended into the water column. Is it respired, or does it simply settle back down to the seabed somewhere else where it's then integrated back into the sediment by the benthos? To answer these questions, we recently submitted a large NERC grant in the UK to understand these questions, and we're hoping to attract just over £3 million of funding to address these questions using theoretical and also empirical field experiments. It's also important to understand what the footprint of trawling is, in other words, how much is occurring and where it's occurring. And with access to vessel monitoring system data, shown here for 24 regions of the world, we were able to actually compute what proportion of the seabed, down to a depth of 1,000 meters, was impacted by trawling. So in these pie charts, if the area is green, it shows you it's untrawled. And we can see for Australia that in the majority of the large regional areas around Australia, large proportions of the seabed are untrawled, and relatively small proportions experience any trawling at all. But if we contrast that with Europe, where the history of fishing is much longer, we see that much larger proportions of the area are trawled intensively, shown in red, and relatively smaller portions of the seabed are untrawled. And the worst case in Europe is in the Adriatic Sea, where we see that over 50% of the seabed is intensively trawled and a relatively small area untrawled. So we can identify those regions where we expect the impacts of fishing on carbon stores possibly to be the greatest, and Europe certainly would seem to be one of the key areas to focus on. We can also ascertain from this relationship a nice predictive model. So in other words, if we understand and can measure the swept area ratio, we're able to predict the proportion of a region that is actually bottom trawled. Now this is very useful to know because for many areas of the world we do not have access to VMS data, hence why we only showed 24 regions in the last slide. But what this means for some of the other important areas of the world, like Southeast Asia, if we had an estimate of fleet size and we knew something about the width of the fishing gear that was used, we would be able to calculate swept area ratio, and from that we could deduce the proportion of a region that is impacted by trawling, and hence ascertain what the threat to the seabed system and carbon stores in that region are. So I'd like to thank you for your attention, and should you wish to contact me after this presentation, then you can find my contact details via email on this slide. And just to note that I'm summarising over 30 years of research which has been funded by many different groups, government bodies, NGOs and seafood industries as well. Thank you for your attention.